Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our webinar this afternoon. This is hosted by the RTPI Young Planners of Thames Valley and also the ACE Emerging Professionals of London and South East. So welcome from both organisations. As you may be aware, I'm chair of the ACE organisation for that region and vice chair in the Thames Valley for RTPI. Today we've organised this event collaboratively as the idea has come from a previous event last year, which was on intelligent infrastructure, focusing on buildings, and that was hosted in London, looking mainly at employment and office buildings. And today we're going to be taking a more planning focused look at this, so hence the collaboration with the RTPI. And looking at transport planning as well, focusing mainly in Oxford. As some of you may be aware, we were intending to host this physically in March at Savills offices in Oxford. So thank you very much for offering to host us. We would have loved to have been there, but a webinar will suffice, I'm sure. So thank you very much to our three speakers for joining us and agreeing to be on screen and filmed. So we are going to be talking today about how digital technology can be integrated into our planning and into our infrastructure. And the groups will be also writing up some notes afterwards and sharing those out on social media. And we will be having, there's a handout as well for you to look at some extra links after the speakers have made their presentations. So I will hand over to our first speaker, Mr. David Bainbridge from Savills, from their Oxford office. David has not always been Oxford based though. He has done stints in Northampton and in Milton Keynes as well. He does focus on development across the Oxford to Cambridge arc, involving discussions with clients, consultants, stakeholders on infrastructure provision. And he wants to seek to the future-proof developments where possible and look at that longer-term vision. How can we make our society really ready for the future and new technologies? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Annabel. Thank you very much indeed. And obviously, thank you to the RTPI Thames Valley Young Planners and to ACE Emerging Young Professionals as well. Delighted to be here. Hopefully you can see my slides on the screen there. I'll just go over to the first one now, which is really just to the background. And I'm really pleased to see such a good turnout for this webinar in particular, because it is a very interesting topic matter for everyone involved in the built environment, I would think. Some will know that Annabel gave me a nice introduction there. I've been in town and country planning for 22 years now. I think certainly when I started out, planning for digital technologies and infrastructure wasn't necessarily at the forefront of the agenda, but it definitely is so now. And the points that I want to cover from my planning background are really what are aspects of intelligent infrastructure, look at the national guidance in respect of planning, look at some local examples in terms of policy for intelligent infrastructure provision, look at the planning for delivery, which is generally more on a site-specific basis, and also look at some interesting initiatives which some of you may well be familiar with. So when it comes to intelligent infrastructure, I mean, my take really is primarily that it's about communications. And in respect to communications, which are so important for the making of place and placemaking, whether it's in the urban environment or in the rural environment. Now, I won't have the opportunity to cover a lot of the references which I've got on this slide and future slides in any great detail, but I think it is relevant if we take that bottom image, which is the Building Digital UK. As you can see, that's part of the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sports. So often as a planner, I'll be involved in initiatives from the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. But of course, there's an interrelated initiatives, and of course, Building Digital UK touches upon various aspects of planning for development. Some will be familiar that the government has the aim for 95% provision of superfast broadband, and also initiative in terms of rural gigabit connectivity. That's a program that we've got underway, and for future provision of fibre across the country. Now, on the 17th of March, so relatively recently, March of this year, the Secretary of State, Oliver Dowden, announced that the government will look to legislate that all new build homes will have to come with gigabit speed broadband fit for the future. This is part of the overall plan to level up the UK, which is probably a comment that many have heard the government using. The initiative really is for developers to be legally required to install high quality digital infrastructure from the outset. And the mechanism for that that's been flagged is through the building regulations for them to install speeds of over 1,000 megabits per second in new build homes, but the cost cap of up to £2,000 for installation per dwelling. I've seen that some of the providers have effectively offered to subsidise the cost of that in some regards. But I must say, as a planner, I've yet to see it come through consistently across sites, but that was said to be building regulations. The next point there is a future telecoms infrastructure review. So that's July 2018. Again, that's DCMS, and it relates to the government's overall industrial strategy. And some will know that links into the local industrial strategies, an example of which I'll come on to later on. So what they're looking for here is for the majority of the country to have 5G coverage by the year 2027. And it made reference back then in July 2018 to planning reforms to enable easier and cheaper deployment of mobile infrastructure. Of course, some of those reforms have come forward, not least in terms of permitted development rights for some of the infrastructure provision. Then the final image there, which is the National Infrastructure Assessment, that was the first one prepared, also in July 2018, by the National Infrastructure Commission. Some will be so familiar with the work of the NIC, but in this particular document, and it stood the test of time over the last 2 years, they come up with various recommendations related to digital technology, low carbon energy, and of course, the future of the nation's roads. Moving on now, there's a number of points which we think are relevant when it comes to planning for development, and this is about the national guidance, so at the national level. Of course, you'll all be familiar that the planning system is about the primacy of the development plan. So make a plan, a development plan, often called a local plan, take decisions in accordance with the policy within that development plan, unless material considerations indicate otherwise. We've highlighted a few sections of relevant guidance. So the National Planning Policy Framework, Chapter 10, is a relatively short chapter, worth a flick through if you haven't done so already, paragraphs 112 to 116. I'll just pick out one point of paragraph 112 where it says that advanced high quality and reliable communications infrastructure is essential for economic growth and social well-being overall, and that planning policies and decisions should support the expansion of 5G. I've highlighted paragraph 34 there. That's about development contributions. That's under chapter 3, which is about plan making. So again, it comes back to the making of plans for areas. And it gives digital infrastructure, although it doesn't specify, but it gives digital infrastructure as an example of the types of infrastructure where development plans should set out the expectations for contributions from development. So typically section 106 contributions. Obviously that's subject to tests under paragraph 56 on planning obligations, tests under the community infrastructure levy regulations such as section 122, and also of course local development policy. Now, the planning practice guidance, sometimes referred to as the national planning practice guidance, when I've dipped into it and reviewed it and what have you, I think it's relatively quiet actually when it comes to provision of digital infrastructure. I'll be happy if any of the participants want to correct me on that if they feel there's a particularly relevant point. But the points I've picked up are really in terms of design and the designs for place making. And there is reference within there because it's linked into the Building Better, the Building Beautiful Commission work, which many will be familiar with, that really we should be planning for digital infrastructure from the outset, whether it's in making of plans or indeed the planning for individual development sites. I think we'll probably all agree that retrospective decisions in respect of any aspect of infrastructure rarely makes for a good place. Infrastructure delivery plan. Now, this is an infrastructure delivery plan both for a local plan, so part of an evidence base, and also it can be for the site specific, which I'll come on to in the next slide, as it were. But the infrastructure delivery plan is part of an evidence base for a local plan. So important to understand what infrastructure is required, whether digital or otherwise, you know, your traditional engineering type infrastructure, road junctions and what have you. for that to be costed and to make sure that it doesn't undermine the vision and objectives within the local plan overall. And of course, many of us will be familiar with the fact that development viability is increasingly important at the plan making stage. It is not just the preserve of planning applications or planning appeals. It has to be something which is demonstrated through examination into local plans. So regional and local policy and strategy, conscious of time, so I won't cover this in a great deal of detail. And again, there's a number of reference points here. Some will be familiar with Planning K and the Oxford Local Plan. Both those plans have policies, development plan policies within them, which are aimed towards aspects of digital infrastructure. And of course, being local plans, they are forward-looking. So Planning K adopted it in March of last year. The Oxford Local Plan just adopted literally last month. Both require, albeit with different sort of quantitative targets, they both require electrical vehicle charging points within certainly residential development going forward. And what's particularly relevant is the policy CT6 in Plan MK talks also about electrical vehicle charging points for buses. The South East Midlands Local Industrial Strategy, which was July of last year, that is prepared by SEMLEP, South East Midlands Local Enterprise Partnership, in partnership with others, of course. What's interesting, if you see in that document, is that it has a picture on the front of the MK pod, which is driverless vehicles, which we'll come on to shortly, which is in front of the train station within central Milton Keynes. It's worth looking at that document because there's so many references to digital infrastructure provision across the area covered by that local enterprise partnership. And of course, there are other ones which are relevant, including in Oxfordshire, I should say. Final point there on this slide is England's economic heartland. Some will be familiar with that body, which really has a number of initiatives and good thinking under its belt, working in partnership across the Oxford to Cambridge arc. Well, they've got a draft transport strategy with a proposal to become a statutory sub-national transport body. It's out to consultation until the 6th of October, and I can certainly recommend everyone has a look at that document because, again, it has aspirations for delivery of digital infrastructure and such like across the local area. Planning for delivery. Now, this really is a canter through of more on a site-specific basis, and what it's looking to do is identify some areas of relevance. So depending whether it's a 50 dwelling development or indeed a 5,000 dwelling development will dictate the level and scope of documentation for applications for plan promotion strategies as well. But normally one would expect on the larger scale developments that there's an audit of the utilities such that one can know what the utility strategy will be. That will then lead into a cost plan, which will underpin an infrastructure delivery plan, whether digital and or otherwise. And I think increasingly looking at some of the development plan policies, there needs to be aspects which will inform some of the detail of the sites going forward, such as electrical vehicle charging points and service runs in layouts, on detailed layouts, working with architects, landscape architects, engineers, surveyors. It's so important at the earliest possible opportunity to understand where the service runs are in layouts and make sure they can be accommodated with minimal impact, especially one would say below ground cables and the planting of street trees, which is a particular interest of mine. And then digitally enabled, that's what it's all about for developments. So really my final slide, conscious of time, are some interesting initiatives, which I must say always put a smile on my face every time I see these types of images, and some of you who are participating will be so familiar with these. So the images on the top right as I'm looking at the screen is a Starship robots. They're 6-wheeled vehicles which provide delivery of certainly food and some other packages and are in operation in Milton Keynes, particularly central Milton Keynes. I think that's an image, might be in the hub in Milton Keynes if anyone knows of that location. The bottom right image is Catapult Transport System. That has many projects, but the one just identified there, of course, is the self-driving pods, driverless pods, which are referred to earlier on. And they've been testing on UK streets since October 2016. When I looked that up, I was quite surprised at how long they have been out on testing. And then the final image there is Amazon drone delivery. I'm not aware that that's taken place yet in the UK, but I did check that actually in the middle of last year, there was reference by Amazon to it coming into place literally within months. It hit the headline news. I think it was on News on 10, News at 10 on the television. Haven't seen it coming through. My final 2 points before I hand over is to say that within the area we're operating within, let's call it the Oxford, the Cambridge arc, and cuts very much overlap to the Thames Valley area. there are a number of locations which are leading into research into new initiatives, digital technology. Just to mention a couple, Cranfield University, Millbrook Testing Ground, both in Bedfordshire as it happens, but some will be familiar with that. My final point, I'm very much looking forward to the planning policy paper, which might come up by the government next week, possibly. We'll have to wait and see. And further into the planning white paper and see what that says around the issue of digital infrastructure. So thank you all very much indeed. And I'll hand over to our next panelist. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. That's great. And just as a point for our attendees, we do welcome and encourage questions. If you'd like to use the question function or the chat function, if that's easier for you, then please do. And we will be asking these at the end of all of the presentations. Definitely some food for thought there from David, and I'm always pleased to see a picture of the Starship robots. Anyone who knows me knows how much I love those. But next we'll be hearing from Harry Cross, who will be picking up on automated technology within his presentation as well. And he is a senior transport planner from Paul Basham Associates, based in their Oxford office, and is managing many different projects focusing on transport infrastructure and influencing also policy and representations where necessary, and making sure his public and private sector clients think to the future and make sure their developments are truly desirable. So I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Lovely stuff. Thanks, Annabel, and thanks, David. Hopefully we'll sort of touch on a few points there. But yeah, welcome. My name's Harry Cross, as Annabel said, and yeah, I'm going to hopefully sort of touch on a few sort of elements, sort of more from a private sort of sector sort of viewpoint. So kicking straight off, I suppose Oxford, we all know, is quite a unique city in terms of its blend of historic features, street layouts, as well as sort of combined, as David mentioned, sort of being on the forefront of sort of research and technology too. I'm sure we can all appreciate the challenges when it comes to designing around the various modes of transport in the limited street space that we have, and sort of that can sort of help alleviate, I suppose, some of the issues when we look to sort of see how infrastructure can help sort of look at the road, the street space, the parking and pollution. And I guess from a transport planning perspective, this can be inclusive of policy and standards, cycling, public transport, high-speed broadband, electric vehicles, and autonomous vehicles. So we'll move on. Yeah, David touched on the sort of national and local policy, and that for us is sort of one of the main things that can sort of help focus planning efforts in a certain direction. So from a transport perspective, this can relate to things like, I suppose, vehicular and cycle parking provision, and sort of bringing a bit of our experience into the forefront. We've recently come across sort of several innovative and intelligent ideas that can help focus more practical approaches to planning. For example, there's a commercial development that we're working on in Sidcup, where trip rates couldn't be agreed with the local authority. So an agreement was actually made to monitor trip generation with a built-in sensor at the site access to essentially validate trip rates compared with the submitted transport assessment. Essentially, contributions were then to be made towards sustainable transport if vehicle trips were over the levels predicted. I think this could link into maybe what Llewelyn might say a little bit later. But also there was another example, Borough of Poole Council, I believe, have a contributions policy essentially for new developments that's based on a level of parking provision. Under provision, you'd essentially contribute towards more sustainable modes, and over provision, you'd contribute more towards sort of road improvements. So essentially a flexible approach that helps focus development contributions based on the impact the development is likely to have. I suppose from our experience as well, a more sort of local example, looking at a retirement development actually in Abingdon, it's quite clearly was in a demand for an over provision of sort of cycle spaces for the retirement sort of residents. Could that sort of focus be better made more towards a focus on what the development will have an impact on. For example, I suppose community buses, or sort of more appropriate things in that regard, really. Yeah, so I think there might be scope to assess the viability of some of these sort of things within the planning process in Oxford. I know that there's the workplace parking levy is being discussed, and that will essentially secure funding towards some of these schemes and measures, for example, the bus gates and sort of other highway improvement works. But also one of the other key factors is the sort of car-free element of the local plan. Sort of needs to be led perhaps by the local authority to where contributions can then be made from the developer, not necessarily junction improvements, but maybe taking into account sort of more sustainable and intelligent infrastructure. Moving on to cycling, obviously we know cycling in Oxford is very popular. I think a Department for Transport study in August 2018 suggests that the proportion of Oxford residents that regularly cycle is roughly 3 times the national average. And I'm sure we would have seen that in and around Oxford. But despite the prevalence and popularity of cycling in Oxford, certain apparent leaps forward in terms of intelligent cycling infrastructure might not have taken off quite as we've expected. I'm sure we would have all seen the Doctor Spike schemes, for example. There's massive influx of these over the last few years, but either sort of little uptake, misuse, and even COVID-19 has led to the sort of many companies sort of backing out or putting a pause on this for the time being. Potential not quite fulfilled, despite the sort of app technology seemingly being quite a good fit with the cycling friendly city that Oxford is. So hopefully more to come there and sort of perhaps room to develop. I suppose in terms of sort of hard infrastructure, segregated cycle lanes would probably be a better, more ideal sort of attractive prospect to cyclists. It's not entirely feasible in all of Oxford due to the constrained width, I suppose, of the historic streets. But I suppose one of the solutions presented actually in Connecting Oxfordshire, the proposals include allowing cyclists through sort of traffic restrictions, for example, the bus gates. I suppose removing cars in the city centre frees up room for bikes and buses. But also, for an example, if bike safety could be improved, I think bike crime in Oxford is quite prevalent. And if the safety there was improved, would that improve cycling usage as well? Something like the Westgate Cycle Hub sort of prided itself, I suppose, on better surveillance and secure storage. So maybe that's something to look at as well. And yeah, moving on to looking at public transport. Yeah, bus, rail and coach opportunities in and around Oxford are of high quality, especially in the main transport corridors, sort of with Botley Road, Woodstock Road, Banbury Road, Cowley Road and Abingdon Road, and even further afield with connections to London and the relevant airport connections as well. So it's all quite good. However, I guess as a county as a whole, has a large number of rural areas where connectivity is much less frequent in terms of buses. So solutions that have been investigated previously, such as the East Oxford Pick Me Up bus scheme, was a first of its kind demand and responsive sort of ride sharing service. Seemed like a good solution. I think it was quite popular, but with the rise of smartphone usage as well, it's sort of quite links into intelligent infrastructure. But I think it lacked commercial success to make it past the initial 2-year trial period, but perhaps something to look out for. Yeah, as you might know, investment into Oxford Station is long overdue as well, and the master plan takes into account sort of pedestrian, cyclist, car, bus, and taxi trips within the design. But essentially, yeah, I think there's 18 capacity for 18 bus interchange, a 480 space multi-storey car park, 2,500 cycle parking spaces, but that requires more sort of hard infrastructure changes in terms of sort of like the restructuring of Botley Bridge. So it's no small task really. But I know recently, possibly even yesterday or the day before, Oxfordshire County Council were sort of investigating introducing emergency active travel measures within its programme. looking at introducing COVID-19 bus gates, essentially trying to restart the economy, which I think had identified 2/3 of shoppers within Oxford use the park and ride. So focusing on being able to sort of concentrate on those sorts of shoppers helps enable restart of the economy by prioritising that traffic ahead of everyone else. I think moving on. Yeah, David touched on this earlier with the high-speed broadband. Obviously, we've been experiencing this over the last few months, and Oxford has access to high-speed broadband in the majority of the areas. And has expanded over recent years, but I think focus, like with the buses, on more rural connections could make a difference with regards to people needing to commute into the city, sort of freeing up that space essentially with sort of working from home. Obviously, these practices include sort of remote access to sort of working servers, web and cloud-based applications, and sort of what we're doing here with teleconferencing or webinars can help cut down those unnecessary vehicle trips. And I know that the digital infrastructure program, which I think Llewelyn is involved with, is seeking to enhance these moving forward. So hopefully the sort of opportunities from the COVID-19 impact, where we've all been working from home more often, can help enforce sort of a real modal shift away from the single occupancy vehicle car trip. And yeah, hopefully that can move forward. I know, for example, Sheffield Council were planning on creating a digitised public highway later this year with sort of thousands of individual wireless sensors communicating the latest smart technology sort of involved in the Internet of Things, sort of giving real-time traffic data outputs to improve sort of service delivery and cutting air pollution. I think Llewelyn might touch on that later as well. As well, electric vehicles, obviously, yeah, Oxford has been sort of trialling some of the sort of first pop-up sort of charging points within, I think within Jericho, in residential streets, because obviously lots of sort of terrace housing, people don't necessarily have the option to charge their cars on their driveway. And there's also trials, I think, as well, looking at higher voltage charging points within lampposts. So we're being sort of at the forefront of that technology. And I think, yeah, Go Ultra Low Oxford as well. You can see there that it's sort of a sort of online map where you can see where available types of electric vehicle charging points are based on those needs. So that's looking to the future there. And yeah, I think David mentioned earlier, but sort of Milton Keynes is also at the forefront of that, and they have been recently trialling the sort of wireless charging electric buses in Milton Keynes as well. So that's quite exciting. And yeah, finally, with sort of reference to autonomous vehicles, we've got some sort of industry leading companies here in Oxford, such as Oxfordshire, that are sort of doing sort of great stuff there, looking at autonomous vehicle testing. And I know that they're sort of looking at that area in the RACE in Culham as well. And as David touched on earlier, the sort of the trials for the sort of the Milton Keynes delivery vehicles there as well. It's all quite exciting, and there's also opportunities there for freight as well to try and cut down on sort of pollution there. And I think that should broadly have taken me to the end. So I'll say thank you very much and pass back to Annabel.
Thank you, Harry. That's fantastic. And I think, yeah, you'll start to see as we move into Llewelyn's presentation some even more vision for Oxfordshire and in his role as leading their innovation for the County Council. And I'd just like to say we've had a few people join a little later on the attendees. If you have missed anything, this has been recorded and will be on YouTube afterwards. Or if you've been here the whole time, you might just want to watch it all again. So we're going to pass on to Llewelyn now. As I mentioned, he leads the innovation team at Oxfordshire County Council and has built up an outward focused research and innovation team, which are looking to develop strategies for transport and environment improvements. and also looking at challenges related to social care, education, public health as well, and how we can innovate in those areas. So without further ado, Llewelyn, please take it away.
Cheers. Hopefully you can see that. Let's come up. So we're a slightly unusual service sector, I think, in a council, in that we are an innovation service that works across the whole of the county council now, and it's evolved out of planning and transport, really. So a lot of our projects are still in that sector, but we've moved to working projects across the whole of the council now, and it's run out of a team that's called iHub. So we've got a sort of very much an outward focus, I think, which is we're trying to evolve now again to provide more support to the services in the council itself. These are the sort of areas that we work in the most. I'm glad to see the connected autonomous vehicles came up a lot, as we have the biggest CAV team in the country supporting the trials that happen in Oxfordshire. And we like to believe, and we hope that we have been part of building up the CAV sector in Oxfordshire, which is now ranked at about the biggest in Europe in terms of the amount of companies and investment that's come into Oxfordshire in that sector. So that's been really important for us, and we've had a lot of learning along the way with that. So yeah, as I said, we work generally. We work on collaborative external projects. So most of our projects are funded via the likes of Innovate UK, Horizon 2020, innovation projects funding from government itself. In the last 5 years, we've been pretty successful, and we've got projects that are valued around 120 million. They've actually got up to 130 million recently, because we've just won another project. And we've done 60 projects as we counted them lately. So we're either engaged still or have completed 60 projects with partners, lots of different businesses, mostly from R&D sectors, but not all. And we're there as an enabling function usually for these projects, but sometimes we are the sort of problem owner as well. It depends what the projects are themselves. So what I want to talk about here around intelligent infrastructure is, I think, what's interesting about our position as planners, transport planners, and within councils in particular, is that the world is being disrupted quicker than ever, and now a lot of that disruption that's originally came from the sort of software industries is happening to our place as well. So this is something I'd like to put up as a slide. It feels like to some extent we're in this position again. So the picture on the left was New York in the 1900s, and the one on the left is only a decade later, and you can see how it transitioned from horses to cars. I mean, only a decade. And the picture in the middle is just the adoption curves of different technology, and as you can see, the further you get to the right, which is modern day, there isn't a curve anymore, it's just goes straight up. So things get adopted much quicker than ever, and which puts a lot of pressure on our places and how we manage and plan for those. So we have to start to think differently about that, and we have to sort of take information and adapt differently, and maybe even plan differently. And I think that has to be adopted into both the way we plan environments, but also how we manage them, and how we think about how we're delivering new developments themselves. But on the same sort of, that's the challenge side of it. The interesting side, I suppose, from our perspective and my team's perspective, is we also are active in all of these areas. So we're probably one of the only organisations that have an interest in what's happening minute by minute, hour by hour, daily, yearly, and decades through to planning. So there's an interest for us across all these timescales. And then we also have multiple domains. So we're one of the few areas that have to think about all these different areas as well, which within our organisation and within our sector in terms of planning as well, we actually are subject matter experts and very knowledgeable about these different areas, which is really important for the innovators and the R&D sectors, because if we can bring that intelligence to them, they can iterate, hopefully produce something that works better for customers and communities, and hopefully don't do something that disrupts things in a negative way. So that's part of our role, is to learn constantly, but also work with the innovators. this is a debate that's going on. As do we move from predict and provide and then go through all the way through to iterate and adapt, and it feels like we're moving towards iteration and adaptation. If we want to do that, then we need really, really good intelligence, and that's constant real-time intelligence, and that's where the intelligent infrastructure comes into it, because a lot of that can come off our own assets. So what I'll talk about in the sort of second half is some of the projects we're doing, to just give you an insight into some of the projects that are of interest, hopefully. This is these are smart cameras that we've put up that do image detection. They use an algorithm called YOLO, which is You Only Look Once, which is actually an open source algorithm, but they've really trained these. So these are also in Milton Keynes, and London have them, and a few other places. We've got them in Oxford, a few in Didcot, and some in Bicester as well. But they're really valuable. So we don't see the imagery; they just use the cameras to then they apply the algorithm over the top of the imagery to just detect things that move. So we put these up to detect cyclists, because, as anyone will know who's cycled around Oxford, our cyclists don't stick to cycle lanes, and traditional cycle counters are just terrible at counting actual cyclist numbers. So we use these to detect cyclists primarily, but they've also been really useful to detect pedestrians as well, and give us really accurate data on all modes that are using Oxford. We've had them up for a year now, and we've just launched, after a few months validation, we've just launched something called Oxbike, which is really interesting if you want to go on and have a look. That's an open data stream from our Vivacity cameras. I took this about half an hour ago, I think it was, or an hour ago, just before I came on, and you could see there it showed. I just clicked on Magdalen Bridge, which is our busiest cycling and pedestrian spot. You can see there's 4,000 cyclists over Magdalen Bridge in 24 hours, 19 in the last 5 minutes from when I took that. It was around lunchtime, which is actually quite low for lunchtime. Maybe it's because it's so sunny. But yeah, this is really interesting. That's actually really, people find that really interesting and have been looking at that. That's there to allow our users, communities and user groups to sort of look at different data. There's also travel time graphs. So we're doing predicted travel times into the town on that website, taking information with cameras, and generally it shows that cycling in Oxford's quicker than any other mode. So hopefully that'll start, the idea of that is to see if people start to get interested in this sort of data. If we put it out there, it gets used. We tried this a few years ago and the uptake wasn't as good as we thought. This has been more well received, which I think partly because we've presented it better. So I'd also say as well is intelligence isn't just from sensors, it's from people as well. So this is another cycling project we did recently, where we built just sort of web-based tool through Esri, the Esri platforms, and we set it up so communities could basically do mapping of assets out in the community. So they went and logged where there are issues in the cycling network, and surprise, surprise, there were lots. We focused this on the rural areas in particular because we knew we had really poor data. So we did it around Witney and Wallingford in particular, and then we've rolled this out now to both parish councils and community groups, and they report really specific information. So they got a bit of training in terms of the detail we want, and they go out as champions, I suppose you'd call them, and log details. This actually helped us in terms of knowing the prioritisation of all the maintenance catch-up that we had to do for the active travel funding that we got in tranche 1, that we did get told off about from government, but it was an early priority that we were going to do, and we had to just do it because there's no point putting a temporary lane in while you've got 5 miles of bike lanes that's overgrown. So these are some of the things we should have done, and it's given us good information to know that where we had to prioritise the maintenance. So air quality is a really big issue in Oxford. I mean, the City Council and ourselves have done a good job, I think, in terms of trying to get that down, primarily working with the bus companies who've also really invested in new buses into Oxford. That's really helped. This is an interesting project we did with Aimson and Siemens, and it was funding through Highways England Innovation Project. So it's sort of related to the A34 and the air quality issues that you get from that on the edge of Oxford, particularly around Botley area. And this was looking at whether we could use real-time air quality data, a real-time traffic management system, to then effectively start to manage the network differently. So the primary indicator of changing the way we manage the network is air quality and not congestion. So it's quite a new thing. We've run it in test phases. We haven't run it in anger yet because we have to go through a few more sign-off processes yet to do that. But it's proving right on the modelling side of things. So this is something that we hope to roll out across the city if possible, and it's something that Aimson themselves are really pushing on. And it's also giving us an extra 15 really good air quality sensors from the funding, and we're combining it from with other data from a company called MapAir that looks to do predictive air quality data alongside things like weather conditions. So these are things that we're learning about, and we're trying to integrate them into our day-to-day management of the network. And in terms of our sort of one of our latest projects, really interesting in this sector of intelligent infrastructure is a project we're involved in called 5G Heart. It's a massive Horizon 2020 project. We are one of the areas involved. It's led out of Finland, I think it is. Yes, Finland. It's the main, the lead, along with Barcelona. One of the Greek universities is also part of this as well. So it's multinational. We're actually the real world test area for the University of Surrey. So University of Surrey is the sort of leading university in the UK in 5G technology. And Oxfordshire is aligned with the University of Surrey, and so we've been working with them, but they needed a real world test area for when they get out of the University of Surrey site itself. And so that's what we're doing there, is we're providing that. So we're going to be putting some 5G applications out into Oxfordshire. It's a sort of a route that goes around from Oxford all the way down to Culham, because part of this will eventually be looking at applications in autonomous vehicles. Initially, we're looking at air quality sensors again and real-time information routing. So this is getting routing information directly back to connected vehicles initially, and eventually autonomous vehicles. And then the later applications that will be done 2021 to 2022 will be applications with AV. So this is when we try and break 5G. So we're going to see what we can get over-air updates. If we can get the over-air updates onto autonomous vehicles while they're moving, this will be done in Race and Culham for those elements. And then we're also going to do things like see if we can upload the LiDAR imagery that we get from autonomous vehicles over the air. These are massive data sets that you would never dream of doing this. So at the moment, a lot of the focus has been on how we get that data set post. So when a car docks back at a docking station, for instance, you might upload that, because that information can be really valuable, again, for understanding our assets and networks. So that will really test what 5G can do, and hopefully lead on to many other things. And we hope that it will also be integrated into some of the standards for autonomous vehicles themselves. So I think that was my last sort of example. I mean, the key thing for me is that there's a lot of stuff happening now that we can integrate into new developments. So there's Vivacity Lab cameras that we use, for instance, perfect for new developments for assessing the impact and then actively iterating around the management of that new development. And that's whether it's investing more in public transport or walking or cycling or whatever. And I think that's what I hope the technology can do, is allow us to be less fixed in what we're asking new developments to do and be more adaptable.
Okay. Yeah, that's fantastic, Llewelyn. Thank you very much. I think everyone has given food for thought, and if people do want to submit questions, then go ahead. We don't have time to answer today. I'm sure our speakers will kindly try and give some answers either out on social media or via the RTPI and ACE. So just to kind of start to gauge some ideas from our attendees here today, we've got a few polls to invite people to vote on, and which link to these discussions. So we'll start with the poll on the impact of COVID-19, the buzzword of the moment, and something that I think all of you slightly touched on there, and particularly Harry did, with the impact that it's had on the cycling initiatives and apps. So if everyone who is with us today and the attendees would like to have a vote on, do you think there will be a lasting impact of COVID-19 on planning for infrastructure? So we're thinking here, is it going to be long term and not forever, or is it completely irreversible? Will we be changed forever? So we've got quite a number of votes flowing, and I can see it in the background here, and it's quite exciting. Almost all voted now, and we'll hear some views from the speakers as well on what they think in just a moment. So 81% voted. Anyone else? Final call out. Okay, let's close that poll then and see our results. Should pop up in just a moment. There we go. So I think no one there is saying there'll be just a short-term impact. We're not going to go back to our ways quite yet, but it's fairly evenly split, 52 and 48% between whether it'll be irreversible or long-term. I'll invite Llewelyn, I think, first to have some thoughts on this based on the data sets that maybe he's been collecting over this time, and whether there's been a change in that, and what his projections maybe are.
Yeah, so we know in Oxford that we're still running at about 30%, 30 to 40%, depending on different corridors, down on a typical number of vehicles that you'd expect to be coming into Oxford. Now, and that's even with less numbers of people using buses. Cyclists numbers are also down, but I think this is primarily because of the commuting. So I think Oxford's unusual in that there's a high level of employment in the centre, and also the high proportion of that employment is probably working from home, because it's either public sector or universities, so which provide the largest amount. So I think that's the main impact for why you get both down. We know that cycling use for leisure time from our Strava data that we also have is massive. It was up, I think it was up 500% at the peak compared to typical levels, which is a big increase. So what do we say? I mean, we're already pushing to try and get more cars out of Oxford anyway, so we're trying to we hope to use things like the bus gates that Harry mentioned to fix this in. So we want less cars coming through Oxford and coming into Oxford. The biggest challenge. You'd
like to see quite a permanent impact then?
I think so. I mean, we're trying to make it a permanent impact. The trick for us is public transport. Is most of the way we do it at the moment is getting people onto buses. So how do we make that safe? So we're working really closely with the bus companies, and we're the first place to launch an app called Passenger Connect, which runs through Facebook Messenger, that's been used on trains, but it gives you real-time information on the levels of occupancy for buses, and so the idea is to try and get information to people so they can make as informed decisions as they can.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And I think, I mean, the next poll that we'll put up in just a moment is inspired by David's maybe slight call to action, really, that planning policy needs to potentially catch up a bit, really, with some of these innovations. And so if we open up the poll on policy, and we'll see if people agree, what do they think? Is David's call to action justified, or is he not quite having a band of followers like you might expect? I think that from my experience, there's quite a lot of variation in planning policies and whether they're clear on their expectations. But maybe some people find that it's every time they're getting what they need from policy. So we've got almost everyone voted, a couple more coming in. Let's see how we go. Looks like it's going to be a different result to last time. Okay, we've got 80% voted, last few seconds. Okay, right, we'll close that poll and let's find out what those results were and see. Oh, well, we've got a small number of people. 5% are saying that they think there is enough guidance, so they must be working in some pretty innovative areas. The majority, though, 62% are saying no, we need a lot more. So I think, David, you're being endorsed a bit there. But we've got a fair amount, a third on sometimes, which is good, because at least it shows that we have some examples and case studies to lead the charge. I think, David, you alluded to Plan MK and also Oxfordshire's local plan as at least starting to lead the way. Is there anything, David, that you think specifically in policy is maybe lacking even from those more forward thinking authorities?
I think really when it comes to development plan policy, that there needs to be the guidance from the national level so that there's a level playing field. I mean, the government talks about levelling up the UK. I know that's a slightly different concept, but it's very difficult when you know, a local planning authority is preparing a plan to try and understand when it comes to particularly the development management policy aspects of it, whether it can be bold and look for new initiatives or whether, you know, it'll be pushed back. And I have to say, quite often a number of authorities do get pushed back when they're trying to be bold in some of the initiatives which they're including within their policy, and pushback from participants who might object, and indeed from planning inspectors. So I think that national level guidance, because there's a lot of good intentions and initiative at the local level, but I think really there needs to be that level playing field. I mean, even for example, you know, if you're a developer and you're looking to have, you know, one development in Milton Keynes, a development in Coventry, Reading, wherever it might be, the policy framework at the local level is going to be different. So that's where you need to look into the detail and say, right, are we required to provide electrical vehicle charging points? And if we are under local policy, what is the level of provision? What happens where you've got flatter developments or you've got dwelling houses which don't have parking spaces within the curtilage of the dwelling? What happens there in terms of charging points? And so, yeah, more can be done, but there's some good examples and hopefully they'll come to the fore more.
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, so for those who don't know, I work at Storey Homes as their planner in-house, and often the question is, yes, what is the requirement when you're looking at a site up front, and doing that viability assessment, as you mentioned, David, is so important from both the council side and any developer side. It is, if there are quantifiable kind of exercises you can do to try and understand exactly what is needed, and maybe, like you said, in the more niche schemes of flattered developments or things like that, and being a bit more flexible about where you actually put your funding for infrastructure, and making sure everyone can travel in the best way possible. So we've just got time, hopefully, for one last poll. And we're going to touch on now autonomous vehicles, which I think have come up a few times. So we'll get that up there. So simple question: would you choose to use a public autonomous vehicle over your private car? So not necessarily buses here, possibly a little smaller, but would you choose to use this? Oh, we're getting quite a few coming in. Half of you voted now. And just a few more seconds, collect those last votes. Okay, I think we've got almost everybody voted, so let's close that poll and see those results. I feel like a game show presenter a little bit like this. It's quite fun. So we've got quite a number, 22% saying yes, which is quite positive to see. I imagine the transport planner and Harry from Paul Basham will be enjoying that. And we've got 65% saying sometimes, though, which I think is quite fair. It's an alternative mode of travel. I mean, maybe Llewelyn and Harry will disagree with me, but I don't think we're trying to ban the car, but just provide these good alternatives. I mean, Harry, what do you think about in future developments? Should we be looking at going back to the ways of maximum parking standards, trying to discourage people from having cars and encourage them with a bit more of the stick rather than the carrot to go into autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, that's quite interesting, I suppose, because I suppose some people might be quite encouraged to do sort of shorter journeys, maybe sort of if it's sort of slightly out of town development, if to sort of go to the local shops, that sort of thing. But perhaps if you're going sort of further afield, you might initially want the comfort of sort of using your own car, but yeah, who's to say that might not change in the future? Because I suppose if you're sort of communally using a public autonomous vehicle in a development, then even if that's essentially could be a bit of car sharing there as well if you're going to the same destination. So I think all of that can sort of contribute, and maybe it could sort of start. For example, car clubs quite often have sort of car club spaces in developments. I know, for example, in some of our travel planning sort of developments that we initially had sort of voucher-led schemes where you'd sort of get a sustainable travel voucher. And I think it was Surrey County Council actually wanted to scrap all of that completely and just put that funding towards a car club space. So if you could almost have an autonomous vehicle space dedicated within a development, that could be almost like a dedicated taxi service or ferrying people to and from various places. So maybe that could be a start. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, all these thoughts are useful, and that's what young planners and emerging professionals are here to do. Start being creative and thinking, how can we influence the future of our environment? And just, I think, a kind of final question to get a short snippet from each of you, which has come in, which is, are we keeping up with the demand for intelligent infrastructure quick enough? Is the speed of delivery quick enough? I think, and Llewelyn, I'll start with you because you had your timescales chart there, and then we'll have a quick answer from David and Harry.
No.
Simple, effective.
I don't think so. I think it's I think people don't understand what we can put on to our infrastructure and embed it. So it's an industrial issue because we're not designing it in. And a lot of this is if you design it in and put it in at the start, and it's even things like putting the fibre in the ground so you could connect a thing up. It's just it's a lot of it's not. You don't need to put the smart bit in. You just need to put the backhaul infrastructure in, and that's the biggest problem. I think is we're not doing that because sensors will change and adapt, but you still need something to put the data over it. So that's probably a bit. And I don't think we understand the potential enough. Yeah, and then policy. The implications of being able to have active policy is an even bigger challenge for planning in particular. And that, I mean, we're trying to develop an innovation framework that you can that new developments can work with, and it's so hard to see how you actually embed it into any sort of policy framework at the moment. It's almost working. It's almost going on the other side of just promoting it on the basis that this will be good for your development. So you're doing it from a marketing and point of view rather than a force. At the end
of the day, you want your development to sell, and you want it to be attractive. So from that point of view, and if that's a draw, then that's great. We'll go to Harry next. Just quickly, what do you think of the speed of things?
Yeah, I suppose things sometimes have a bit of a lag time, don't they, in terms of the potential and sort of looking at the start and how that then gets implemented. And sometimes if the developer might not necessarily be sort of forced to put something in, they might sometimes try and do the sort of basics and not feel the need to do over and above. So maybe there should be some sort of incentive to sort of include for that, as Llewelyn said at the start, and have the basic backbone there. So.
Well, certainly going above and beyond in this regard should be considered favourably in a planning balance. That's what I would think, and I think that's something that decision makers of all different levels will need to come to grasp over time. So quickly, David, a speedy answer about speed. What do you think about this? How can we improve maybe the speed of our developments?
Yeah, it's not quick enough. I'm sure all of us on the panel would agree with that, but we're certainly seeing many examples of some great initiatives across the area that we're operating in, which gives us a lot of encouragement for the future. But it's similar to climate change. We have to consider that some of these dimensions are international. Investment in terms of 5G network, for example, we don't need to be too specific, but it has an international dimension. So there's only so much one can do, and there's some great examples here, and we can we can improve by sharing knowledge and experience. So yeah, we'll get better, definitely.
Perfect and wonderful. Well, thank you very much to all of our speakers. Like I said, if anyone has any questions they'd like to follow up with after the event, feel free to send them in and comment on the YouTube video as well. I'm sure everyone will try and pick up what they can. So thank you to you all, and thanks to Savills for originally hoping to host this event in person. Hopefully we'll get back there and do some kind of social event. And thank you very much to the committees of the ACE London South East Emerging Professionals for supporting, and also from the RTPI Young Planners in Thames Valley. This was the first webinar of both those groups in this time, so any feedback is much appreciated. And the next one for the Association Consultancy and Engineering Emerging Professionals for London South East will be on the Lloyd's building in London, which, if any of you don't know, is where the internal services or external. You can see your lifts on the outside of the building. You'll probably recognise a photo of it if you Google it. So just a little plug there, and all event ideas, either planning, natural and built environment much more broadly, which is what ACE and also the RTPI can focus on. It's not, we're not bound, and we can definitely look at the future of our workplace, the future of our society, and all your ideas are very much welcome. So thank you to everybody and to our attendees for their participation. And that's it, just 1 minute over. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.
Goodbye.